So there are two halves to Peter Pan. There is Peter and there is Pan. Peter can partly be put down to Peter Llewellyn Davis, who was one of the boys that J.M. Barrie befriended in Kensington Gardens and then started telling the stories about. At the time he was only a baby, so it was kind of a joke. This baby would suddenly become this sort of mischievous, wisecracking hero. Peter was also perhaps Peter the Wild Boy, this kind of memory of an almost legendary, but actually real figure from the start of the 18th century who'd been found living wild as a child and then brought to the attention of the gentry, but even as a grown-up seemed still to be living in a kind of innocent or savage state. But then Pan is perhaps the more interesting bit of the story, because Pan goes back to the figure of classical legends, but instead of the Pan that we might be familiar with, who has cloven feet and shaggy hindquarters, the Pan who became successful towards the end of the century in stories by Saki and in a bit of The Wind in the Willows and loads of other places, is a kind of more youthful and playful figure. So in some ways, when Barrie puts Peter next to Pan, what he's doing is picking up on a popular cultural idea of the time and then giving it his own particular kind of tweak, which is to make it a Peter Pan-tomime. Barrie was a real tinkerer. And he wrote a character called Tinker Bell, and he himself was a real tinkerer when it came to his own stories. Peter Pan, he first of all writes as he's a sort of story within a story in a larger book called The Little White Bird. And then he starts to expand it into a play. And one of the things which this edition does is reprint the original draft, of which only one version exists, a handwritten manuscript in which Tinker Bell is called Tippy Toe. Most of the other characters are still there as we know them, but the last act is entirely different. It's a genuine pantomime involving harlequins and columbines and a crocodile rearing up out of a serpentine to snatch Hook and eat him up. But then after he wrote the play in 1904 to 5, Barrie kept on fiddling with it. He kept revising it year after year. Some lines he took out, some lines he put in. For instance, the line about fairy dust, he put in when children apparently were throwing themselves off their beds to try to fly, and there were complaints, so he needs to put that in. But he didn't publish the play until 1928, because, like a lot of pantomimes, he loved the idea of it sounding up to date, full of topical references and jokes. So he would fiddle with it every year. But at the same time, he wrote a prose adaptation of a story called Peter and Wendy. He also wrote different versions of a film, a silent film script. Although the film was never written, again, it's something that was nagging away at him for years. So all these different versions suggest that although Peter Pan the character didn't grow up, Peter Pan the book, in a sense, did. It got kind of bigger and more complicated as the years went by. I suppose one of the interesting things about Peter Pan is that although Peter Pan doesn't grow up as a character, Peter Pan, the idea, has gone in all sorts of different directions. You see it in everything from merchandise to a Scandinavian car ferry that's called Peter Pan, to, of course, more recently, Michael Jackson, who's called the Peter Pan of pop and lived in the Neverland Ranch. But you also see adaptations of the original story, both straight adaptations like the Disney cartoon, but also stranger adaptations like E.T. In E.T., the story which, the bit of the story where Tinkerbell seems to be dying and is then brought back to life is read by the mother to her daughter just before E.T. himself is brought back to life by the other children. So you start seeing these strange ways in which the story has been kind of manipulated and played with over the years. Why? Well, perhaps because it is one of those stories which we grow up knowing, but we don't really know it because we don't know the story behind the story. And the more we get to know about it, the more we realise just how strange it is. And Virginia Woolf said about another famous children's book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that these are the only stories, she said, not only written for children, but the only books in which we become children. And I think she was wrong, because it's not just the Alice books, it's also stories like Peter Pan. We grow up with them, but when we return to them, they remind us that we might be able to imagine what it is to not grow up. And so to fix our interest on a character who never grows up is to remind us that there's a little bit of Peter Pan that, you know, remains inside all of us. So there are two people to thank for Peter Pan, the stage play. One, of course, is J.M. Barrie. The other one is the producer, Charles Frohman, who believed in Barrie, put up a huge amount of money for this completely untried and untested play, took over the Duke of York's theatre, which is a 900-seater, spent huge amounts of money on scenery and on a special new kind of flying harness for the flying scenes, paid for a new set of scenery when the first lot was largely destroyed, when a mechanical lift broke down, paid for the carpenters and all the stagehands to have their Christmas off while Barrie rewrote the play. When it finally opens, several days late, it's a huge success. And what the audience saw, I suppose, depended upon how much they knew about Barrie. So those who knew Barrie could see bits of the family he'd more or less adopted, the Llewellyn-Davies family, their nursery, their kind of marital relationship, their children, even Barrie's own dog, who becomes Nana in the play. But if you didn't know anything about Barrie, what you saw was like a children's kind of story which had suddenly come to life in front of you. So for the first night, the mostly adult audience were absolutely transported, not just to Neverland, but back to their own childhoods. Barrie, of course, was terrified that the climactic scene, which involves Tinker Bell coming back to life through the applause of the audience, would be a bit of a squib, because he was worried that the audience would be, you know, looking at their feet and sort of shuffling rather nervously. And so he asked the orchestra, if no one else applauded, to put down their instruments and, you know, applaud. In the end, he didn't need to worry. Standing ovations all round. It got a huge critical reception, and then it came back year after year after year. Some of the same actors also came back year after year. The saddest bit of the whole production, though, is of course when the children got too big and they were measured every year, at that stage they had to stop being in the play and they were replaced, like Billy Elliot today. And so that's the point at which they realised that the lost boys aren't only lost because they've moved away from their parents. It's like a little warning about the greatest loss that any boy can suffer, which is childhood itself. And of course, Peter Pan, as the name would suggest, it's almost like a pun. It starts off as a pan-tomime. And the earliest version, which is reprinted in the book, is much more explicitly a pantomime. It involves lots of the same elements. And even now, if you look at a production of Peter Pan, the crocodile that appears, which is itself a joke because it swallowed a clock, so it's a crocodile, D-I-A-L, as well as a crocodile, D-I-L-E. The crocodile was originally played by two actors, so it's like a savage pantomime horse. So you've got the pantomime horse, you've got the pantomime dame, and I suppose the other big relationship with pantomime is this idea of the transformation scene. So Victorian pantomimes would often climax with a grand transformation in which, for instance, Cinderella's pumpkin would become the coach, usually with lots of kind of wooden flaps kind of banging around. The transformation in Peter Pan is not just that the stage becomes Neverland, yes, it becomes this other world where anything can happen, a world of the imagination at play. It's also the notion that childhood is a state that you can enter and re-enter whenever you want to, as if the state of play isn't just what happens in a theatre, it's of course what children do all the time. So it's a way of bringing together the world of childhood and the world of theatre, squashing them together into the most popular theatrical form, which of course is one for all the family. Although in this case, one that's been stripped of the rude jokes and chucking sweets at the audience and the bouncing ball with the song lyrics. Barrie himself never grew taller than 5 feet, and towards the end of his life he wrote down in one of his notebooks that he suddenly realised what Peter Pan was all about, which was the desire to grow up but not being able to. But in some ways anyone who read his work knew that, because almost all his work is about both the pleasures and the dangers of not growing up. And in some ways you can trace that back to his own childhood. So his own brother dies on the eve of his 14th birthday in a skating accident. Barrie's mother, their mother, is broken by grief, and Barrie decides to become as much like his dead brother as he can by acting in order to try and cheer his mother up. In some ways, much of the rest of his life is like a set of variations on that same primal scene. He acts and encourages others to enjoy acting as a way of avoiding growing up and enjoying being someone else. One of the reasons why he loved writing plays like Peter Pan was it allowed you to be other people without having to commit to changing yourself. And in some ways, Peter Pan was the most extraordinary incarnation of that idea, because it allows a grown-up actress to imagine being a small boy and never get any older, night after night after night, as if somehow theatre could allow you to pass your time, but could also freeze time. Barrie had been a hugely successful playwright before Peter Pan. And in fact, one of the plays which he wrote just before Peter Pan, you can see kind of hovering somewhere in the background of Peter Pan itself, and that's The Admirable Crichton. The Admirable Crichton is about a butler who, along with his employers, gets shipwrecked on an island. And what happens is that all the other adults revert to a kind of strange childhood state. They start playing around, they squabble, they sulk, they dress up in animal skins, they play with bows and arrows. It's the butler who takes charge. So the natural hierarchy is reasserted. And then when they're rescued, they go back to things as they are. Peter Pan kind of plays a variation on that, because of course often it's grown-ups playing children, like an adult actress playing Peter Pan, and it's on an island, and it's a world of play, but tangled up with a world of pantomime means that it's a much more kind of playful kind of play. So you can see early bits of Peter Pan in his earlier work, and then later on he wrote another play about going to an island where in the blink of an eye you can either age or you can stay the same age forever. So again, you see these kind of aftershocks of Peter Pan in his later writing. But the key thing is, I suppose, that because he didn't publish the play until 1928, so more than 2 decades after it's first put on the stage, that is a play which he's forever rewriting. You know, it is something that he still has this living relationship with. And that is something I was trying to get across in this new edition, this idea that Peter Pan isn't just as a cultural presence, something which kind of goes on and on and on. For Barrie himself, it's something that kept on branching in new directions and taking on new forms. I don't think he could ever be finished with Peter Pan, because the real children he wrote the story for, the Llewellyn Davis boys, of course grew up and they moved away. And sadly, a number of them died, one in the trenches of the First World War, one drowned, possibly a suicide. Another one, after Barrie's own death, threw himself in front of an underground train. Peter, in fact. So the original Peter Pan died in Sloane Square underground station. But of course, Peter Pan, the literary character, was the little boy who would never grow up and would never leave him. And that's one of the reasons why I think he needed to go back again and again to this story, to refresh it, to remind himself of his connection to it. There's a lovely story of his secretary, Cynthia Asquith, quite late in life, going to his flat and seeing Barrie blowing on a fire and trying to spark it back into life. And in some ways that's a sort of metaphor for his relationship with Peter Pan, that, you know, year after year he wanted to kind of bring it back to life.